So what kind of opportunities have we seen to leverage the practical law content in Knowledge Unlocked? So obviously one area has been the single search, and how we can apply the search algorithms, but also the kind of the relevancy and approach law firms take to that search relevancy using insight. I think other interesting area we've seen and is a conversation, Zorik, is around like taxonomies and metadata. I think historically law firms have written very, very complex taxonomies, sometimes with a DNA back into a publisher like yourself. But actually kind of really interesting as we talked about search here, but a big area we hear around the knowledge locator is around browsing and making choices around taxonomy. And I don't know if you've kind of got any insight on, law firms kind of utilizing or asking for the practical law taxonomy and using some of that as a foundation for their taxonomies.
Yeah, I think we're seeing more and more of that, and especially some firms are kind of restarting their journey of building taxonomies, probably because maybe before it was a little overly complicated. We're seeing more and more firms leverage practical law, and I think that's becomes really useful. To that example earlier I gave, right? Practical law gets you 80% of the way there, but you might have some really on point internal document. If those are both tagged to the same topic in a taxonomy, a real value add there. But yeah, so seeing that increasingly, particularly on the transactional side.
Yeah. And we get asked kind of how to map those two together, especially if firms are wanting to put those experiences together. So how can they start to utilize, practical law metadata around their taxonomy and the topics, but also then bringing that into their taxonomies. And I know you're very open as an organization with that taxonomy because it gets utilized in different places. I think the other interesting area is around drafting. Drafting is quite a big topic in legal tech these days. And obviously, some firms spend a lot of time in building precedent banks and template banks and etc. I mean, kind of how do you see the kind of practical law content that you have, and what are your plans around things like clauses within practical law?
Continuing to just make that experience easier and better. So already, obviously, we've got the standard documents and tons of standard clauses, just breaking up those documents and just figuring out ways that we could make searching through that easier and faster, considering that the number of clauses documents now is pretty large. So some enhancements coming around that kind of clause bank concept and being able to tailor that a bit better for those specific needs. And yeah, we see that with firms too that build their own knowledge documents, right? I think we see a range of firms kind of saying, all right, you know what, actually practical law is going to be our knowledge bank. And then firms that are saying, well, no, we are going to maybe start with a practical law document, but really kind of tailor and make our own firm version. But then for some things still saying, you know what, let's use the practical law standard document for certain types of documents.
And I think what's been interesting is we've been kind of rolling out projects around curation of data to allow those, the firm side knowledge documents has been, as we have a more interesting and clever interface, is actually kind of people are using similar metaphors to practical law. So one area we see is things like guidance notes and drafting notes being put onto those. I think traditionally they got put into square brackets in Word documents like halfway through the documents, but what we're seeing with curation is kind of a very similar kind of a view almost as practical law. Is kind of bringing in those drafting notes and how to use documents, not just here is a template and here's a precedent. I think the same question we see around clauses as well is kind of like how, I think there's a lot of discussion about tech which can magically create clause banks, but actually, what is a clause? What's useful? What's a standard clause? When should I use this clause? What time, what type of scenario should I use this clause? And obviously that's quite a familiar metaphor for you, Zorik, in terms of the way that you write the drafting notes onto those things as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's great that, a part of the reason we've started kind of pursuing this API approach and being more flexible and open with that is because we see firms doing that and kind of doing that mix and match that I mentioned of, okay, in some cases, they're going to do the work to figure out what are the right clauses or standard documents and what drafting guidance do we want to give here, but sometimes they just want to say, actually, for this, you should refer to the practical law standard document.
Yeah. And I'll touch on it in a minute, but could you kind of give an overview of kind of the Thomson Reuters API that we've utilized? And, I think it's now about a year old. I just want to give it, if you just want to give an overview of the API, we found it very flexible for bringing both full text, but obviously having access to metadata and specific document types. But do you want to just give an overview of the API strategy that you've had here around practical law?
So for practical law, it's really just been trying to make the documents and the taxonomy available, and being flexible and kind of supporting the multiple use cases firms might have. Primarily, the main one has been search, so they're really making it, all the full text of the documents, so you can index them and have them searchable within your experience. But also being able to leverage that taxonomy. So if you wanted to start tagging documents to that as well. And continuing to figure out other ways to expand what we're doing in that space, particularly as we roll out new features. Across the board, we've kind of just been more focused on developing data APIs to support firms' initiatives. Here, very much a knowledge management and a search use case, but with some of the other data APIs we've launched, we see firms like litigation analytics. We see firms really starting to leverage that for their own internal data analytics projects. So starting to look at what can we do with practical law in that space as well, thinking about things like what's market data? Is there more we could do in terms of making that data available so firms can pursue more data analytics initiatives as opposed to just these search and knowledge management projects as well. So continuing to grow and expand based on what customers tell us they want to do with our data.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to working with you on some of those APIs as well, and definitely the litigation analytics and the what's market on the transactional side is very much a kind of, I can see a lot of data on both sides coming together to make some really powerful experiences.